Let me start by reminding you of a little parable, Zeno's paradox from Greek mythology. Achilles was racing a tortoise, and the tortoise said to him, "You cannot beat me in this race." And Achilles said, "Of course I can." And the tortoise said, "Well, think about it this way. I will start with say, a 10-meter head start, and you're going to run to catch up with me. I will have moved a little bit in that time, so I'll be ahead of you. And each time you catch up with me, I will have moved incrementally further on. Therefore, you can never catch up with me, and you will never win the race." And Achilles said, thanks to this logic of Zeno, "I guess you're right, I can't win the race." That's not true on the Lima COPs. It sometimes seems that way because we've been meeting now for 20 years on these COPs and always getting a little closer to a real breakthrough on mitigation of greenhouse gases. I think Lima, we hope, is the last one of those little incremental steps forward, bringing us towards what we all hope will be a binding agreement on greenhouse gas emissions in Paris the following year. So UNEP has a lot going on in Lima. We're in particular releasing two very interesting reports. The first is our emissions gap report. This is the 4th year we've been doing this, and it shows the difference between the pledges that countries have made for their greenhouse gas reductions as compared to the amount required to keep global warming below 2 degrees C. And there's a gap. It's easy to measure. Because of interested member states also in the adaptation side of the climate change question, this year for the first time we're producing a new report, the Adaptation Gap Report. This is an attempt to try to show what is a kind of a goal that we could globally agree as a community for adaptation, and how far are we along towards getting to that goal? What's the gap? And this is a lot more difficult than the emissions gap report. The emissions gap is easily expressed in gigatons of carbon, one variable. Adaptation is a much more complicated beast. We have finance required for the adaptation, but we also have technology that can be used, and we have knowledge. There are different gaps. A very interesting report in Science magazine today, the 28th of November, argues one of the most effective ways to adapt to climate change is education, having an educated population. This is very convincing. They look at the past ways we've dealt with adapting to climate variability and show that societies with high education levels adapt better, have in the past been more resilient to climate variability and climate impacts. So why not do that in the future? So it just shows you that the adaptation gap is a lot harder to measure. So this report is an initial step at trying to lay out a preliminary assessment, trying to lay out how could we develop an adaptation goal that would be relevant to the negotiations that could be decided in Lima and leading up to Paris, and how could we measure progress against that goal. There have been a lot of meetings in the past, and each one we call it a summit. You know, a summit is the top. And if you go on from a summit, the only way to go is back down again. So when I'm asked how can we move on from the summit, I hate to say we're going back down. I'd like to say we're moving forward. And there are some good signs. One of them are the recent announcements by the President of the United States, Barack Obama, on 2 counts. One was in combination with Xi Jinping from China on mitigation, new pledges to reduce emissions from the United States starting immediately, from China starting soon, which will make a contribution, albeit a rather small one, towards reducing the emissions gap. On the same time, we have recently, last week, we had a pledging meeting for the Green Climate Fund, and about $10 billion was pledged by developed countries to tackle the climate change issue. Roughly half of those funds will be put in place for mitigation and half for adaptation. And this is a very large source of new funding that will be available to countries to combat climate change on the adaptation side and to decrease the problem in the first place on the mitigation side. I think those two things are probably the biggest impetus we have right now going forward into Lima. Now, ironically, they both happened outside of the UNFCCC negotiations. These were not pledges in a big multilateral COP environment. So I think we have to think very carefully about how we can make these big multilateral conventions of the parties useful, and how we can go outside them when it's most effective and use really effective tools for getting momentum where sometimes we get stalled in those negotiations. So we'd really like to see all of these different efforts, the momentum inside the negotiations, the momentum outside the negotiations, come together for an agreement in Paris in late 2015.